the Lawyers Collective, this was the first time the patient groups, thanks to the HIV movement and particularly to TAC, had started to, and to the AIDS Law Project, had started to engage with the area of intellectual property. Till then, it was definitely involvement of the health movement and trade negotiators and organizations like TWM. But till then, patient groups had not actively engaged directly with the intellectual property system. And I think March 23rd, 2005 was the day when, South African, French, activists from all around the world actually spoke to Indian parliamentarians, and there was a pivotal change in the position of Indian lawmakers who till then had been relying on a government's version of a law, of a bill, which had been brought on the eve of the tsunami in India. And till then, most laws on intellectual property were drafted by big law firms. I will not name one of them in particular. And what really happened at that point of time is that two crucial pieces of legislation, one was that were included in the patent law. One was pre-grant opposition, and the other was the patentability criteria. Now, of course, we at that point of time had not realized how big the change we were asking in the intellectual property system. And of course, we asked for all provisions on compulsory licensing by generic companies, by government, and so on. And I'll come back to this provision on compulsory licensing. As we, had a historic win with changing the minds of Indian lawmakers, and we managed to get some of these provisions into the law, the question was, what would we do with it? And immediately, of course, despite all the technical issues that we faced, the Lawyers Collective, IMAC, Preeti and Tahir, Alternative Law Forum, MSF, Delhi Network of Positive People, INP Plus, as I would say, all gathered together to decide that we would, and Cancer Patient Aid Association, we all gathered together to decide that we will challenge patents. It was unheard of. At that point of time, this was very expensive litigation. No one really ever thought that patient groups could do it. MSF itself was, going on a journey that it had never done. And since then, we perhaps have crossed the patent oppositions that we've done, over 100. Now, pre-grant opposition did something that perhaps no other piece of legislation has ever done, which was move the power from pharma companies and governments into the hands of people. So it was our prerogative to decide to challenge patent claims. And till date, till 2015, patient groups were extremely successful. They got a large number of secondary patents, as we call evergreening patents. That means patents on known medicines. Claims filed on, tenofovir prodrug, crystalline forms, not the original compound itself, but the derivatives of that compound. So known in the public domain, but subsequently, companies would keep asking for, these incremental changes to be patented. And that opposition led to a large number of dismissals of those patent claims and led to tenofovir, today dolutegravir, and large number of drugs being in the public domain for generic production. But those were the first early years of success where, patient groups are hugely empowered to use the intellectual property system. And from 2014 to 2021, Indian civil society has been engaging on compulsory licensing. The first engagement came not through any patient group, but through a company called NATCO who filed, who has actually produced a lot of NIBs, imatinib and sorafenib, decided to file for a compulsory license. And actually we worked with KEI to show that Bayer's claim that they had invested a large amount of money into R&D was false, and that indeed a lot of the money did come from the public sector. That was the first compulsory license in India, and since then we've been struggling to do more on compulsory licensing. It's not because civil society is incompetent or doesn't have the technical capacity, as the European Union, Australia have sort of, said we'll give you technical support for compulsory licensing. When we first went to the health ministry with a proposal for a compulsory license on a cancer drug trastuzumab, I think almost everyone thought we had lost it. So, a couple of feminists and Gopa Kumar from TWN, we went to the health ministry and explained why a compulsory license was very important for trastuzumab. And in the face of the compulsory license discussion, Roche backtracked and immediately withdrew its patent. But since then, every time the issue of compulsory license comes up, India is put under pressure from not only the pharmaceutical industry, and you can imagine India is the hub where big pharma's lobbyists sit. They're called government relations guys. So right from Pfizer, so to Merck, to the Japanese intellectual property organization, everybody is here. You have the USTR, and you of course have the European Union flexing its muscles to try and get India to go back on its to have a policy of no compulsory licensing. And the pressure was so effective that actually our trade minister, despite the law, said that India will not be issuing any more compulsory licensing. And that's on the record, that it continues to be on the record. There's been no backtracking from that policy. And in that context, I wanted to sort of highlight the discussion on compulsory licensing and the TRIPS waiver. So monopolies have been creeping up on us. So right now I'm working on a drug called Delaminid, which is, a handful of patients in India have access to the drug. The API cannot be produced in India under a voluntary license granted by Otsuka. The government doesn't want to pay 1275. So typical situation where a patient is stuck between the government and the pharma company. So the government says it's too expensive. Pharma company says we have a monopoly, we can decide prices. Compulsory license has been put on the table several times by civil society groups and every time rejected by the government in one form or the other. So this is not, we are not talking about some theoretical discussion. We are talking about very real people who are dying of drug-resistant tuberculosis. In that context, when COVID came along, to our great surprise, the Indian government supported South Africa on the waiver proposal and became a co-sponsor, one of the first co-sponsors along with South Africa. And if you look into what the government has been saying, that we will solve this problem through diplomacy, I think they recognize that compulsory license has been challenging for them on the diplomatic front because they are faced with huge amount of pressure from the United States, USTR, from the European Union, from pharma, and so on. So they want to solve this problem once and for all for COVID and not get into the situation of, dealing with it license to license. The second challenge the government of India has is it has pretty much a toothless competition commission. I would not describe it any other way. Who has absolutely spent no time in looking at the abuse of dominant position. And so the government is in a situation where its regulatory bodies are not able to function. And it knows that the licenses that are being granted are limited in the sense that they do recognize that these licenses, solve the Indian problem, but not necessarily the problem for the rest of the world. So they pride themselves on being the pharmacy of the developing world, but really what the license is, if you look at baricitinib, which has been recently granted, is limited to the Indian supply. So Indian government basically actually is behind the waiver not because it does not know how to do a compulsory license, as the Australians and others would like us to believe, the governments would like us to believe, and what a hangover, colonial hangover to tell us we don't know how to apply our law when they have not been able to apply it in their own jurisdiction. The European Commission should look into the reasons why it cannot issue compulsory licensing. Data exclusivity is a prime example of that barrier. So, despite the offer of the technical support, what really matters is, I think, two things. One is that the waiver is something that is an important tool for governments to continue pushing for greater access. And I think it should remain on the table and it should not be withdrawn and should not be limited to vaccines, despite the current thinking that maybe we should go perhaps with vaccines first. I think absolutely not. We are on ground zero in India. We've seen people die without the drugs that they need. And we know that there are future breakthroughs coming through. And we absolutely, as treatment activists, would like to see, and treatment providers would like to see drugs covered by the waiver. So I think there are two important issues here. One is that the European Commission, the USTR, and other pharmaceutical industry are collectively responsible for the failure of our compulsory licensing laws. That is one thing. And right now, the opposition to the waiver, by responding and saying that you can use compulsory licensing, is just not acceptable, because they have very systematically undermined all our regulators and our policymakers and have systematically opposed compulsory licensing. So I think at this point of time, the waiver should remain on the table, and governments should turn back to the European Commission and say, okay, if you are going to talk about compulsory licensing, this is what we want. These are the reforms that we want. And one of the reforms that I would like to talk about is shifting the requirement, or allowing people to file for compulsory licenses rather than pharma companies, and leaving it to governments or courts to decide whether compulsory licensing is applicable or not, because then the burden completely shifts on us to show every time whether Delaminate is needed and is of public health importance. So one of the crucial things to talk in the rights movement, and I think even from treatment providers' point of view, is that should organizations who work on public health, who work on health, who work in a particular area of access be allowed, or individuals who are affected by a particular disease be allowed to apply for a compulsory license or to initiate the process of a compulsory license? And how would that look in our processes, in our laws, because governments have failed, firstly. Regulators like competition commissions in our countries like India have failed to do the jobs. So what we need is not compulsory licensing at the expense of the waiver. What we need is the waiver and compulsory licensing for all other diseases. So this is where I'm going to stop. And all I can say is that the contradiction in Indian position is very much an outcome of the kind of constant, non-stop pressure that India has sort of faced over the last few years. And we have watched helplessly while unable to provide Delaminate to our patients. So this is where I'm going to stop. And I don't think the European Commission is absolutely wrong in suggesting that it's one or the other. I think it's both. We want the reforms on compulsory licensing and we want the waiver. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Leena. Excellent timing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Really appreciate it. And I would really ask everyone who has a question to hold on to those, put them in the chat, keep them in your mind, because I would like to now introduce our second speaker, Felipe Carvalho, who's from the Médecins Sans Frontières Brazil, the Access Campaign. He's the country advocacy coordinator. Felipe?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, just a second. I'll just put my presentation. Please check if it's working.
We can. Yeah? I can see it. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's also for me a great pleasure to be in the same panel as longtime colleagues like Leena, from who I learn a lot always, and also Brook, with who I share the hurdles of being a civil society representative in the ACTA mechanism. So I would like to share today the view from Brazil in terms of going a bit broader than the waiver discussion, but the whole environment around how the patent system is working, and what are some of the victories we have seen in Brazil in terms of really making the patent law work for people, and the civil society efforts that are behind that, and how this connected the waiver discussion. So first of all, I would like to clarify that I'm speaking today not only as MSF, but as the civil society coalition that we have in Brazil, called the Working Group on Intellectual Property. This is a group of 18 organizations that was created back in 2003, and MSF it's a member of this group, but we have plenty of other NGOs and community networks. The group is comprised mostly by activists, people living with HIV, human rights advocates, researchers, and since 2003, the activities developed by this coalition have been mostly trainings, publications, a lot of efforts to make sure people have accessible information about patents, treatments, and everything that it's relevant for them to fight for the right to health, but also a lot of actions on strategic litigation, legislative advocacy, patent oppositions that Leena briefly mentioned, and we learned a lot from the Indian activists on how to do it. Campaigning, protests. So it's a group, a very active group that have been working first on HIV, but then expanded to hepatitis C and tuberculosis, and now moving to new focus also, but staying a lot yet connected to the HIV needs for new treatment options in Brazil, although we have a public health system and universal health program for HIV. There are still many challenges for people living with HIV accessing treatments in Brazil. So it's important to say that the experience in Brazil, and I think it's similar in many developing countries, is that patent laws that doesn't really work for people, and there is a lot of imbalance in how the law it's applied. So we normally have much more use of what we call TRIPS plus provisions, or provisions that maximize patent rights for IP holders, and a very underuse of the public health flexibilities. That's a reality in many countries, and Brazil is no different. So we have seen, for example, the most used provisions of the Brazil patent law have been patent term extensions, which means giving more extra periods of monopoly to pharmaceutical companies, and the pipeline mechanism, that was something that was created basically only in Brazil, in which Brazil, in the beginning of its patent system, revalidated patents that were granted in other countries without even examining them. So it was totally unconstitutional. By the other hand, when we talk about compulsory licenses, for example, that is a public health tool, Brazil has used only once in 2007. So there is this imbalance when we look to the application of the patent law. So to confront that, GTPI has been looking for reforms, especially trying to remove these TRIPS plus provisions that are harmful for the health policies, and improve the use of the flexibilities. So during the first years of existence of this group, we have advocated a lot for the use of compulsory license, and we won the battle around 2007 when an AIDS drugs was targeted by a compulsory license. And we started to work a lot with patent oppositions, learning from Indian colleagues that were already doing this work in India. But we also started to challenge some of these harmful provisions. In 2009, there was a challenge to the pipeline mechanism, and in 2016 to the patent term extension provision. And around 2014 and 2015, we also pushed for a major reform in the patent law, trying to have more flexibilities or expand the scope of flexibilities that we have in Brazil. But these efforts were always derailed and blocked by pharma somehow. We made some progress, but they never went to the last mile. But during the context of COVID, things started to change. And COVID-19 brought this sense of urgency that we applied in our advocacy to try to make sure that our long-term attempts to reform Brazil's patent law were getting somewhere now during this moment where everybody was looking to the health budget, to the health constraints during an emergency, and the pressure over the public health system. So all those topics helped us to connect the dots with the IP law discussions. And for example, we saw finally the trial of one of the unconstitutionality actions around the patent term extensions. And this civil society group, GTPI, was already on this case since 2016. But when it started to really get discussed by the judges, we filed new studies evidence that was fundamental, essential for the final ruling. But actually, something that was also maybe even more effective than the studies were really to expose pharma tactics around the trial, because at some point they were really using paid advertisements in the form of regular news. I don't know if you have that in South Africa, but in Brazil it's quite tricky because people read as a regular story from a newspaper, but actually it's a propaganda. But it's done by journalists. It uses graphics, so it creates a lot of confusion. So they have done this a lot to confuse the information, the public debate, and the judges of the Supreme Court. So we exposed that through a story to show how much they have paid for this advertisement, and this really pissed off the Supreme Court judges, and it had an effect in the final ruling for sure, because it was clear that pharma was really trying to create misinformation around the topic. So it went against them in the end. And the result is impressive. We are still discussing the benefits of this decision, but the Supreme Court decided that patent term extensions are unconstitutional. And in the pharmaceutical sector, this means that more than 3,000 patents have been revoked immediately because they were already in this extension period. Another 2,600 patents will lose this benefit of extension. It's a benefit that would happen in the coming 1 or 2 years, but they will not have that. So for drugs like bedaquiline, for example, for tuberculosis, instead of Brazil having a monopoly until 2028, it will be only until 2023, like many other countries. The same for HIV drugs, diabetes drugs. So it's a major winning for the sustainability of the public health system in Brazil. Another attempt we have been doing to build upon this COVID-19 sense of urgency, it's also around compulsory license, because we know that there are many shortcomings, many gaps when it comes to implementation of compulsory license. So trying to solve that through a new legislation is something that society is quite interesting to do. So we have been pushing parliamentarians to really bring back compulsory license, because actually it was used in Brazil back in 2007 and never again there was any attempt to use it. So the first effort was to raise the topic again, and then to have parliamentarians doing actions and proposing bills around it. And it worked really well, because we had between 2020 and 2021, 18 law bills only on compulsory license. And 8 out of these bills proposed an automatic compulsory license system. That was the main aim from civil society, that we had something that could not be undermined by political pressure, by diplomatic conversations, by pharma pressure. So once there is an emergency, the patent applications related to the products needed to confront that emergency would be automatically licensed, and all the procedure is described by law. So there is no need for any measure by the executive power. So the aim was really to protect the compulsory license from all this kind of negative influences that we have seen over and over again in different countries. But this proposal of the automatic compulsory license didn't went through. But there was a different proposal, Law 12, that prevailed, and it contains already some good improvements, like really having a new system for compulsory license that can be faster, that has very clear deadlines, and then has also civil society participation during the definition of the target products. There are some obligations of sharing knowledge, so it's also a good bill. It's not the ideal text that civil society was fighting for, but still it was something that was reaching some level of consensus in the parliament. So civil society understood that was important to create some pressure for its approval. So it has been working really well. We had major winnings in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and in the Senate again. So the bill is fully approved by the Parliament. You can see in the image some of the civil society protests. This is in the building of the Parliament in Brazil. So there was a campaign in support of this bill that was projected with lights in the building, also to close to the voting sessions, so parliamentarians would remember our message and our ask. And there were major winnings, as you can see, in all the houses. And just last week, we had the presidential sanction of the bill, but actually there are some vetoes in the text that are problematic, and basically they block the application of this new law to COVID-19, which is absurd because the bill was created in the context of COVID-19 to respond to this specific pandemic, but also future health emergencies. And also, I will show you maybe the most crucial part of this project is that it goes a bit beyond the regular compulsory license practice and also imposes some rules for sharing of know-how by companies. So there are some obligations that companies need to share the necessary and sufficient information for the effective reproduction of the object protected by the patent. So this means including biological materials and any other data that alternative producers may need. And if patent holders do not do that, they will have their patents nullified. And on top of that, also government bodies can share the information that they have from regulatory dossiers and any other files that were, and public institutions are not bounded anymore by the obligation to protect undisclosed information in those particular situations. So that's basically the focus now also of the vetoes by the president. They have removed these bits of the text, so really leaving companies to have no obligations at all in terms of knowledge sharing. So we are fighting to get back this text now in the parliament, because the final word is with the parliament, and we can maybe recover this ground that was lost during the presidential sanction. But the good point is that the last bit, the fact that regulatory agencies and government authorities that have technical dossiers, they can share what they have with alternative producers. And this is already a law. This was passed, that's why it's in yellow. So there is no discussion anymore on that last point. So that's a winning. Of course, we want also to put obligations on companies, but we need to recognize that this last paragraph, it's already a good winning from civil society. And probably my time is running out, so just to build on something that Leena already mentioned, something that we consider a very important improvement in the compulsory license system that is also approved now with the sanction is that civil society can participate in the process. In this case, it's not that civil society can request a compulsory license, as Leena suggested, but rather that the government needs to create a list of products for compulsory license, and civil society needs to be consulted. So it's already a good step in that direction, that we have this consultation where suggestions can come from civil society to expand the list or to build upon the list that was created by the government. And just quick final remarks, and sorry for not having time for the waiver point, but I just would like to say that in Brazil, we have this position that Brazil, I think, is the worst kind of position, because it's not even in favor or against the waiver, but rather a middle ground position in which the country doesn't want really to compromise and say, so it's rather the waiver is not necessary, we don't disagree, but we don't agree. So it's a very hard position to discuss. But we have seen that working with the Parliament and the Supreme Court has been quite interesting to contrast the position that the executive power was taking in the waiver discussion and also in the national response to the pandemic. So the Parliament and the Supreme Court, they were willing to create a distance from this, let's say, bad behavior by the government when it comes to the pandemic. So this helped a lot in getting all these victories that I mentioned. Another important point in the discussions here we have seen is really countering formal terrorism with real-world evidence. We always saw narratives like, if Brazil approves anything like this, companies will move away from the country, and Brazil will run out of vaccines, all kinds of terrorism to really scare off parliamentarians and policymakers. But when we look to real-world evidence of how much of those threats in the past were really taken forward, we can see that these are actually empty threats. Also, another problem that we know that happens a lot in the patent system is that the patent applications actually doesn't have information that they should have, and a lot of things are actually covered by trade secrets. So it's important really that patent compulsory license mechanisms, they can address that. The fact that, to really reproduce something, you need to go beyond patents. You need to move into the trade secret space. Lastly, also, I think it's very important, as Leena said, the public ownership of the flexibilities. This flexibility should not be necessarily in the hands, under the control of governments to decide when they use, when they don't use. So we need to create these mechanisms to make sure people can activate all range of flexibilities when there is a public health need. And finally, we hear a lot about not touching patents because this can harm the whole innovation ecosystem. But at the same time, we are seeing our health systems go bankrupt or going into huge debts to finance the response to COVID, to buy these very expensive vaccines and drugs. So I think we should reverse the discussion and really connect the flexibilities to the protection of the health systems, because we heard a lot about the protection of patents and innovators, but much less about the protection of health systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. I'm going to now introduce our third speaker, Professor Brook Baker from Northeastern University. He's also associated with KwaZulu-Natal University and the Health Gap Project. Professor Baker.
Well, thanks everyone, and it's a pleasure to be virtually in South Africa. I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully that time will come. So I'm talking about a very particular and in some ways narrow effort to address a compulsory license that would allow export from Canada of a COVID vaccine to a recipient country that can't produce on its own, namely Bolivia. And I think most people know a little bit about the background of so-called Article 31 bis of the TRIPS agreement. The Doha Declaration drew attention to the fact that a particular provision in Article 31 of the TRIPS agreement, namely Article 31F, contained a provision which would make it virtually impossible for countries without manufacturing capacity or with insufficient manufacturing capacity to source needed medicines from other countries, because those exporting countries would be restricted by their own internal compulsory license to primarily serve their local market, so that the majority of product would have to be used domestically. And at the time when India, for example, was already becoming the pharmacy of developing countries, and particularly for HIV medicine, and it had approximately 2.5 million people living with HIV, Africa had 25 million. And there was no way that Africa could be supplied from India if compulsory licenses were necessary because of that particular provision. So the Doha Declaration demanded an expeditious response. The response was not expeditious. It was waiver, paragraph 6 didn't get passed until August 30, 2003. And it has very labyrinth procedures, but it still did set up this system. So Bolivia fairly early this year announced its intention, as the WTO required, to become an importing country because it lacked sufficient domestic manufacturing capacity. And relatively quickly, a company in Canada, Biolyse Pharma, issued a statement that it intended to use the Canadian Article 31 bis mechanism to produce and export needed quantities of a COVID vaccine to others and to eventually to supply Bolivia. Biolyse and Bolivia had discussions. Biolyse said that it expected at least capacity to produce 20 million doses per year and promised 15 million doses of those to Bolivia if the compulsory license were granted and if it could produce in time to meet Bolivia's need. As required by the Canadian legislation, Biolyse was required to negotiate for voluntary license with Johnson & Johnson and did so, and Johnson & Johnson rejected that request. Because that request was denied, Biolyse is now trying to figure out how to use the Canadian system to actually get the compulsory license for export issued, but Canada is blocking it from doing so, and I'll describe how it's blocking in just a minute. So Canada was one of the early countries to adopt Article 31 bis procedures into national law, but it placed additional hurdles along the way. It's only been used once in its entire history, but in fact, it's the only use of Article 31 bis anywhere in the world. The agreement was used once for antiretroviral medicines, for medicines produced by Apotek in Canada to supply Rwanda. And Apotek took nearly 4 years to accomplish its use of Canadian system at that time, and announced afterwards that it would never do it again because the procedure was so arduous. So as I said, the Canadian legislation does require the applicant to negotiate first with the right holder. That's not necessarily a requirement from Article 31 bis. There are cases in international law under Article 31 where prior negotiation could be waived. It could be waived for emergencies. It could be waived for government use. It could be waived for competition violations. The Canadian law did not recognize any of those exceptions. But in any event, regardless of that, Johnson & Johnson quickly rejected the application. Under the Canadian law, the second step is to file the required application to the Canadian Commissioner of Patents. That must include a lot of very detailed and sometimes complex information. It has to include the name of the pharmaceutical product, the specific quantity that will be manufactured, the patents which may protect the product, the names or name of the importing country, and the identity of the purchaser in the country. So these are all very specific requirements. And one of the more complicated ones is to name all the patents that might protect the product, because then you have to do a detailed patent landscape on the product in the country, and that is sometimes difficult to do, and it certainly takes time and money to do so. In addition, the applicant must provide a copy of the notification that the importing country had provided to the WTO or to the government of Canada about its intention to use the system. So Bolivia, of course, had already done that in this case. But a key requirement for the Canadian system, which is not required by Article 31 bis directly, is that Canada has a requirement that there be a product be listed as an eligible product to be exported. And this list is developed by something called the Order in Council in Canada, based on a recommendation for the Ministry of Industry and the Minister of Health. Biolyse has made dozens of requests simply to find out the information about how to get the product listed, what contact number to use, how to break into the system at all. And it continues to do so. And in fact, even, notifying members of Parliament in Canada, basically saying, what can we do to try to get this onto the list, because it's not there yet. The original list, of course, was created a long time ago. And it was recognized that additional products might be needed to be added in the future. And the mechanism was supposed to have an informed and transparent process for doing so. And a committee was supposed to be established by 2008. And 13 years later, there's no website with respect to any such committee. No existing advisory committee has been put together. And there's no clarity about any process to get the Schedule 1 additional products listed. And of course, COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics were not on the original list because the disease was not known back then. Canada has come up with what is in a way a silly excuse. It says that the producer must be able to produce and test the vaccine, and it's not sure that Biolyse could do so. Biolyse says that it could do so, but the main issue about this list is it's not a list designed only for a particular candidate to be able to apply for compulsory license, but basically it's for medicines that might need to be exported. And then if they're qualified producers, they will apply. And if they're not qualified, the country Canada will grant it. But to prejudge whether something should be on the list because the Canadian government hasn't even begun to assess Biolyse's actual capacity is just to totally undermine the system. So Canada is simultaneously blocking the actual use of the mechanism for use by Biolyse. At the same time, it's touting its effectiveness in the World Trade Organization along with other countries. So Canada has continued to challenge the TRIPS waiver procedure, and is argued, as has the European Union, that the existing TRIPS flexibilities are sufficient to deal with the problem of overcoming intellectual property barriers to the products, and has even touted its own existing law, saying that it's a good example of a mechanism that can work and that it has worked once in the case of Apotex back, 13 years ago. But Canada only has to look in the mirror to see how disingenuous its position is, where it refuses to amend the list of COVID products that could be imported at this time, thereby directly undermining the ineffectiveness of the Article 31 bis mechanism in the current crisis. So there's many ways why Article 31 bis is not well suited for use to respond to the COVID pandemic. There are, of course, multiple notifications that are required from the importing country about its intent to import and its lack of manufacturing capacity. Least developed countries don't have to prove that lack of capacity, but other countries that are not least developed countries need to do so. The exporter must also provide multiple forms of information about itself, the license, the product, the countries receiving imports, the quantities to be exported, required product differentiation, and also create a website that contains required information. If there's a patent in the importing country, a compulsory license has to be issued. If there's a patent in the exporting country, there has to be a compulsory license issued. And so, there's multiple compulsory licenses required. And just as a note, multiple countries have not adopted Article 31 bis procedures into the national law at this time. But this product by product and country by country requirement presents a procedural nightmare and requires truly mountains of paperwork. The Article 31 bis requirements have to be met on a product by product and country by country basis. Although Article 31 bis does directly reference that it's available for active and pharmaceutical ingredients and finished products, it may not be possible to use it for all of the other components that are needed in the manufacture of a COVID vaccine, of which there are over 200 components in some and manufactured in 18 different countries. To meet the needs of the over 100 countries in the world that lack sufficient manufacturing capacity would require, huge amounts of work in all of those countries, so multiple license for export and import. You can just imagine the multiplication of effort that's required. And of course, to incentivize generic entry, you need a sufficient market size so that the market seems attractive to not just one generic entrant, but hopefully multiple generic entrants who would have a viable and sustainable market. And even after the intellectual property, in this case, the patent barriers are overcome, there's still regulatory barriers that must be met. Felipe already did a good job to point out that Article 31 bis, and in fact, compulsory licensing as we know now, is not well suited to address all of the intellectual property barriers that impact access, particularly to vaccines and biologic products. It does not address data exclusivity. It does not address trade secrets. And many countries, at least richer countries, have also opted out of use of Article 31 bis. So unless these additional barriers are also addressed, relying on Article 31 bis alone will not suffice. And of course, that's one of the advantages of the waiver proposal, is that it does directly address additional barriers beyond just patents. The proponents wisely chose to address both trade secrets and also copyrights and industrial designs, which affect other COVID products. The EU, in particular, is touting bogus clarifications of Article 31 bis that are actually quite clear under existing law. But the main problem is that Article 31 bis is simply not fit for purpose in the COVID pandemic, and just it creates too many procedural barriers to effective use. That said, and I'm getting close to the end of my time, countries should still take steps to improve and use whatever compulsory licensing mechanisms they can. As Brazil has done, efforts should be made to simplify and expedite emergency compulsory licensing procedures. The compulsory licenses should be amended to include trade secrets, confidential information, and to override data exclusivity where it exists. Civil society activists have also been proposing the creation of a compulsory licensing facility that would help coordinate compulsory licenses on key products among many countries, and especially the upper middle income countries that are excluded from existing voluntary licenses and that do not receive favorable tiered prices. But I would say that compulsory licensing and even Article 31 bis may still be particularly appropriate for use of small molecule medicines, something that Leena emphasized, I think, earlier in her presentation. Patents are the main barriers, and once the patent barriers are overcome for these medicines, they can be easily reverse engineered and produced by qualified manufacturers in many parts of the world. And fortunately, we have a group of promising novel antivirals that are on the near horizon, for which there will be inadequate supply and for which generic production will be sorely needed, and where voluntary licenses will not cover all the countries that will need these medicines. So even though my presentation has been highly critical of compulsory licensing, I don't want to suggest that countries should not do everything they can to use it where it will help them access medicines that are needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Baker. Excellent. I think there you will get quite a few questions on the very sort of specific, and I've got a few in my mind at least. Our final speaker is Katie Gallogly-Swan, Boston University, and she works at the Center for Global Development. She's a policy coordinator of the joint project. Katie.
Thank you, Rafia. So my talk today is going to be a little bit more focused on the political economy of the challenge of global vaccination, and thinking about some of the policy directions and routes that are not being taken, particularly by those countries that host vaccine originators. Well, and to start, I suppose, is to clarify, there's no shortage of challenges that leaders have faced in the last 18 months of COVID-19, but the most profound failure has been this ongoing inability to drive global vaccination sufficient to end the pandemic and get it under control. Severe inequality both between and within countries has hampered the public health response since the beginning. As of today, the US has administered at least one dose to around 61% of their population, the EU around 65%, and the UK over 70%, compared to low-income countries who've administered at least one dose to less than 2% of their people. For every one vaccine administered in a low-income country, 117 are given in high-income countries. So this isn't a vaccine problem, this is a system problem. With the support of tens of billions of public funds, multiple viable vaccine candidates were developed in less than a year, which is an incredible scientific feat. But severe vaccine scarcity has meant that advanced economies cornered the market, often buying many times their need and leaving few for lower and middle income countries to purchase. I'm sure everyone on this call is already familiar with this story. Currently, Germany has sufficient vaccines to give 4 booster shot doses to their people, and many countries such as the US have wound up wasting millions of doses that could have been used elsewhere. Meanwhile, health systems that have been severely under-resourced after subsequent structural adjustment measures and debt distress have buckled under the strain. We can't forget that the hollowed out health systems and manufacturing capacities have been decades in the making. Indeed, more than 60 countries were spending more on debt servicing than on health budgets when the pandemic began. And the debt crisis is only deepening when at the same time G20 leaders say that they're going to do whatever it takes to end the pandemic. We now know that it's a fallacy that advanced economies needed these doses more and that they were the worst affected by the virus. Analysis has shown that the Global South has suffered far more deaths and more economic hardship from the pandemic without the same fiscal and public health buffers as their wealthier counterparts. This inefficient distribution of vaccines has and will prolong the intensity of the pandemic. But fixating only on how to divide available vaccine doses also eludes the obvious solution. As other speakers have mentioned, the world needs more vaccines and fast. But the manifestation of global asymmetries in the production and distributions of vaccines has and will continue to have deadly and costly consequences. And in my opinion, is an indication of one of the most important tensions in the global division of labour, technology and power for the years to come. Making more vaccines is obviously not a simple task. I've been learning from the presentations of fellow speakers today. There are issues not only from the IP side, but also of production, development, vaccine hesitancy, logistical problems with supply chain bottlenecks, difficulty with storage, transport, staffing. So I don't want to make this seem like there are simple solutions. No single policy will address these manifold challenges. But relying on this current approach is meaning that 10,000 people are continuing to die every day. There's no choice but to advance efforts on multiple fronts. So first, more of the vaccines that are currently available must get to under-vaccinated regions. And one way to accomplish that is immediately ramping up donations from vaccine hoarding and producing countries. G7 countries, as an example, have not met their commitments, even though they are far from enough. And the flow of newly produced shots must also be redirected. So far, COVAX, which was set up to try and equitably distribute available vaccines, has achieved only about 10% of its commitment of 2 billion doses pledged by the end of the year, which in any case was only targeting getting vaccination rates to 20%. It was never going to be able to reach its goal with advanced economies, circumventing it to opt for bilateral deals. But regardless is some of these COVAX doses have ended up in the hands of wealthy countries who've already vaccinated a majority of their population. In June 2021 alone, COVAX sent over 500,000 doses to Britain, more than double the amount sent that month to the entire continent of Africa. The World Health Organization's proposed moratorium on booster shots must be supported and extended until broader vaccine equity has been achieved to that end. However, while these initiatives are unequivocally necessary to begin the slow backpedal away from over a year of self-defeating vaccine nationalism, they don't alter the mechanics of a system that is set up for this inequity. The complex challenge of transitioning to a more equitable approach, however, is being rejected and resisted on all fronts. It's no surprise that the last year has seen an unprecedented amount of money spent by the pharmaceutical lobby. It's doing everything it can to coax leaders to protect pharma profits, which have, by the way, led to 9 new vaccine billionaires in the last year. So what are the policy tactics that could be taken to increase production but are either being blocked or not considered? The first tactic is now widely known. It's clearing away the thickets of patents that deter genetic production. As we've been discussing, last October, South Africa and India drafted a proposal for waiving certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement at the WTO. The undergirding rationale being that traditional intellectual property protection has no place in a global pandemic, particularly when every vaccine candidate has benefited from public investment to get their development off the ground. These are public goods. This proposal now has the backing of almost every WTO member, despite the fact that the US's support is caveated with a restrictive approach, when really what we need is that comprehensive all COVID-19 related products. The waiver would allow countries to temporarily waive their domestic IP laws, and domestic producers could technically begin to manufacture and sell patent-protected products without negotiating a license with the originator firm and without fearing domestic or international legal repercussions. But a few countries are still blocking this. The EU, despite their parliament voting in favour of it, showing just how democratic that institution is. Norway, Switzerland, Australia, Singapore, and a few other nations like Brazil continuing to equivocate. Their critiques of the waiver have been rebutted numerous times, as in this call too, but the EU single-mindedly latched onto the idea that compulsory licensing is the right tool for the job, despite the fact that these would be a more onerous route than the waiver, requiring different pieces of legislation for the many patents that make up any vaccine product, as other speakers have already explained. But of course, countries can and should still seek that route simultaneously. But the second tactic is sharing the recipes and know-how so that other facilities across regions can get manufacturing off the ground. Whether or not a waiver is achieved, that doesn't mean that regional hubs are ready to jumpstart production. That requires deeper collaboration, technology transfer. To best make use of an expansive TRIPS waiver, vaccine originators need to actively engage in technology transfer, granting licenses with a global territorial scope to all relevant knowledge and equipment needed for product manufacturing. With a record number of successful, relatively cheap and fast technology transfers already undertaken under the auspices of the pharmaceutical industry during the pandemic, the mRNA technology of some COVID vaccines could be a suitable candidate. And despite criticism from pharma companies and organisations like the Gates Foundation that building up capacity is too difficult in the South, the World Health Organization have identified 19 manufacturers from more than a dozen countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America that want to ramp up mRNA vaccine production but lack access to the technology. And many of these firms are in regions that are severely under-vaccinated, like Vietnam and Bangladesh. Firms have historically been happy to engage in technology transfer if it enables them to expand their supply into new markets, but firms are unlikely to voluntarily transfer prized technology and know-how to others viewed as competitors. This is especially true with mRNA technology, which is likely to form the basis of a new generation of therapeutic treatments. And for this reason, traditional technology transfer often relies on carefully crafted contracts and strict IP protection, as we've seen with the situation in South Africa, where opaque contracts meant ready doses being shipped to the EU when there was more need domestically. Appeals to patent holders to facilitate technology transfer are not yielding results. It doesn't matter that you ask kindly, they're not going to do this voluntarily. Allowing the pharmaceutical industry to retain all that power in licensing technologies which are needed to end the pandemic is only going to lead to more time wasted and more lives lost when we can do so much more. The states which do host forums, the US, UK, Germany, China, Russia and others, should create incentives, whether negative or positive, to compel technology transfer with the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, CTAP. This could, as an example of a negative incentive, be a windfall tax on the profits of any company who does not participate, who refuses to actively engage. Alternatively, the US could feasibly use its Defence Production Act to compel sharing, or could share the rights it acquired via its big vaccine investment push to increase production across regions. These are routes that could be taken up if the will was there, but these countries are not exploring these transformational routes. Countries who have facilities that could be upgraded to make vaccines should also be making a lot more noise right now about it. South Korea, for example, just recently were reported in the Financial Times as pleading with the US to share tech with their firms. Some countries that are developing their own vaccines, like Cuba and Mexico, are leading the way by already committing to open collaboration in vaccine technology and pooling manufacturing capacity with other national partners, highlighting the crucial role of South-South collaboration in tackling these vaccine monopolies. Tactic 3, so that's TRIPS waiver tech transfer. Tactic 3 is securing the financing needed to upgrade facilities for increased manufacturing. So far, resources committed to vaccine equity efforts are deeply insufficient. Not only is not enough resource being committed, but they're not spending the money wisely. The current model focused on funding the COVAX facility, which works to purchase doses on behalf of participating countries, sometimes at a higher price than bilateral purchase agreements. This ensures patent holders continue to gain a high price for their product, and many pharmaceutical firms are already taking advantage of the market dominance by increasing prices, even charging poorer countries more than advanced economies. According to Oxfam, vaccine monopolies have made global vaccination at least 5 times more expensive than it could be if products were sold at cost price. So there is a choice. Continue this model, draining much needed public resources while maintaining lower levels of vaccine production, or with the TRIPS waiver and the right basket of incentives to get tech transfer off the ground, significantly invest in regional production hubs for cheaper generic versions of COVID-19 products. Again, I'm not saying that it's as simple as 1, 2, 3, but that is the lay of the land, of the directions, the routes that you could go in. The former route promises to delay reaching sufficient vaccination rates for many years, costing the global economy as much as $9.2 trillion. And the latter route has the potential to shift power away from a few dominant companies, achieving greater regional accountability for production while building future resilience to new health threats, and has been estimated to cost about tens of billions in comparison. Regardless of whether the status quo or a transformative approach is taken, however, there is no excuse for underinvesting in a global vaccination drive. As many have noted, it is the best stimulus package the global economy can get, will save millions of lives, and will end a prolonged economic destruction and loss of livelihoods. But without any one of these 3 tactics, the waiver, technology transfer that is facilitated and engaged, and financing, it will be difficult to seriously increase the scale of affordable manufacturing needed to end the pandemic. But if achieved together, the world would be in a much better position to scale up vaccine production and meet global needs. But if these steps had been taken at the outset of the pandemic, it's likely that there would already be a number of additional facilities producing billions more vaccines to meet the need. And we must avoid at all costs a situation when we're saying the same thing in 2022. As a side note, my team will be releasing an updated briefing on some of these issues tomorrow. I'll put a link in the chat where you can sign up to our newsletter so that you can get a notification about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. I have already asked, said two things in the chat, which is please, you can put your questions in the chat or raise hands. I'm deeply grateful for everyone. It was amazing, amazing talks. if you can raise your hands and then specify who you're aiming the question at, that would be great. Of course, speakers are also very welcome to have questions for other speakers. And yes, it's great to see everyone. Leena, if you could see you too, that would be great. Let me just see here on the side. Okay. There's a hand. Oh, Brook, if you have, go ahead.
So this is a question to Katie, though. It will probably be interpreted more as a comment, which it probably is. We see a lot of so-called technology transfer, which is really tightly controlled contract manufacturing agreements, particularly for fill and finish manufacturing, and including in South Africa. And maybe you could spend just a minute, and maybe some of our South African colleagues could chip in as well, identifying the problem of being satisfied with fill and finish when what countries actually need is independent manufacturing capacity across the whole spectrum of product needed to make a final vaccine or biologic medicine.
I can come in on that, but I do feel like my colleagues and well, Fatima and Rafia, who've been dealing with the situation with the opacity of the contract for fill and finish in South Africa, are probably better placed to comment on that.
I'm going to pass this on to Fatima.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think if you can hear me, if people have been following the story both in the New York Times and since, I think it links quite nicely with what Katie's been talking about, the political economy, right? So I think there's two things that have happened with the fill and finish license. It's a ruse, I think, to quieten civil society around the demand for the waiver, compulsory licensing, and full manufacturing licensing. So the situation is that you give one license to Aspen to make J&J vaccines for South Africa and for the rest of Africa, most of which have not been delivered, don't seem to be delivered in large numbers or volumes in the next few months, while Africa is sitting, as Katie says, at 3% vaccine coverage, with the ability, and I think it goes to what Felipe and Leena have been talking about the power of pharmaceutical companies, the ability of Johnson & Johnson to extract from the South African government an export waiver. The South African government is not allowed to ban exports or restrict exports, and as a result, at least 32 million, we believe, maybe even more vaccines have left South Africa after the fill and finishing from Aspen for Europe. I mean, there's some conversations and discussions now around the AU taking some kind of belated action months into this pandemic. It's now September 2021 to pause those exports, not to revise the contract, not to remove that provision, but just to pause it because there's been so much bad PR. And then alongside that, there was a lot of pressure on Pfizer in particular, because a lot of African countries are also using Pfizer, including South Africa, because of the pause on AstraZeneca, because of the delays in supplies from Johnson & Johnson. So Pfizer gives a fill and finish license as well to Biovac, which is a company in South Africa. And the irony is what Katie and Brook is talking about in relation to the mRNA hubs. Biovac is the partner for the mRNA WHO hub, the first one set up in Africa, which is based in South Africa. A lot of press conferences and PR and lots of celebrations around that. But nobody's come to the hub. And what Pfizer does is it doesn't share its technology with the hub. It does a side deal with Biovac, which is a partner in the hub, which nobody has seen the contract. We're now filing legal requests for a copy of that license and contract. And presumably they can only scale up production in 2022 for about 100 million Pfizer vaccines, which is for 50 million people. When you compare the population size of Africa, which is about 1.3 billion people, to get to 60-70% vaccine coverage, you've got this Pfizer deal, which is going to give you very little, maybe next year, I'm not sure if we must all die by then or if we must all get more sick by then. I don't know what the end game is here. And then Johnson & Johnson that has this Aspen 220 million plus an option of 180 million, 400 million vaccines for the AU, which it hasn't even delivered 2.5 million vaccines. I mean, yesterday they made a big story about 108,000 vaccines being sent to Ethiopia. I mean, that's scandalous. It's September 2021. And so, I think, Brook, the point you're making about the power at play with Canada and with the EU to then turn around and say to us, well, go use a compulsory licensing mechanism, and you can't get your waiver, you can't get full tech transfer. There's no real voluntary cooperation broadly on the technology and the scale up. I think it's just like a slap in the face for people particularly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And obviously, I'm more close to the issues in Africa because we're based here, but also because there's only 3% vaccine coverage. So I don't know what else it's going to take. I mean, the WHO has been calling this out. All of us have been saying this is the worst form of vaccine apartheid that you can, witness in your lifetime. And, here we are all also trying to get one or two compulsory licenses or still try and fight for the waiver. So, I mean, all of that to say is that we're in a really difficult, perilous situation. And the laws and the system and the WTO and TRIPS is actually not helping our efforts. It's actually harming. Thanks, Rafia.
Thank you, Fatima. I'm just going to go to a question in the chat before I go to Leena, if that's okay. That's for Professor, for Brook, about the growing anti-vaccine protests in some countries and whether then the IP waiver proposal should be abandoned because of vaccine hesitancy. I know how I feel about that, but I'll let you answer.
I have an extraordinary short answer. No. But the longer version is, I think there's, without denying that vaccine hesitancy is a problem that communities and health professionals need to address in governments, by far the biggest problem is supply. I mean, I think uncertainty fills a vacuum. And for people who are waiting in line month after month and possibly year after year, who search the internet wondering how they're going to survive and then are, subjected to all these myths and erroneous information from non-credible sources. I mean, that does contribute to vaccine hesitancy. Some people are motivated to demonstrate. Some libertarians think, oh, you can't put a jab in my arm. What business is mine to protect someone else? But the huge problem is supply. I mean, I hope it gets to the point where we're really just confronting vaccine hesitancy. If we got there, we would have 60 or 70% of people in Africa vaccinated, right? It isn't that we shouldn't do something in the meantime. But until we get increased supply, or more accurately, equitable distribution of supplies that already exist, we're going to be, I think, distracted by stories about vaccine hesitancy instead of focusing on the supply problem, which is much more serious, the supply and distribution question.
And I think there is data, as far as I know, that shows that vaccine hesitancy is very low in actual fact in Africa. People are far more pro-vaccine. Leena, if you had your hand up.
Yeah, and so there are two parts of this conversation. I think one part of the conversation is that, good public health programming is based on IC and community involvement. It's not that, condoms were just adopted overnight by communities, and we had to do a fair amount of hard work to put condoms out and actually have them used, by vulnerable people, by the general population. And I just feel that, the way the vaccines and, of course, governments and the healthcare systems are so backed up, that, IC and community involvement seems to be the last thing that, on their mind. But what we have seen in India is when the waves came, the demand for the vaccines went up tremendously, So everyone who was sitting on the borderline about vaccines is that month in April decided they also had to get vaccinated. And that's where India had to take this very harsh decision to, India, in fact, I think it was a very painful decision, both for Indian civil society and government, because, The Indian government, of course, prides itself on being the pharmacy of the developing world and had to roll back on supplying these vaccines. And pretty much if it hadn't been the fact that these vaccines were being produced on Indian soil, we would have been, 1.3 billion in Africa, and our population is pretty similar. We are going to see nearly 900 million people vaccinated by December or January or the first quarter of next year, which is tremendous and goes to show that the Indian model of producing everything from APIs to vaccines from start to finish is far more sustainable, at least domestically, if not internationally. That's one. Number two is this, that this is not MSF's position. I have to be very, very clear, but I do believe in an open conversation. What I call the cult of the mRNA. The cult of mRNA is basically that could we not have a tech transfer hub for, say, other vaccines, for the J&J single dose one. I'll give you an example. India's Sputnik vaccine producers, which are an open source model, who are struggling to make the second dose, are actually very similar in their platform to the single dose J&J vaccine. So they could actually technically make the J&J vaccine if they wanted to, if they were provided the technology. So I think we have a common battle between Canada, India, and South Africa and Africa Union on the J&J single dose vaccine. And I think by focusing too much on the mRNA vaccine, which I think is important technology, no doubt, having fought for the MABs at one point, I'm not discounting the importance. I'm just simply saying that today when we talk about vaccines, we're pretty much always talking about the mRNA vaccines. And I think we need to shift the discourse from the South, particularly if African activists and the Indian activists, because we have a major problem. Can you imagine if we could roll out the J&J single dose in India? You're vaccinated 900 million people and you're doing this twice over. So if you had a single dose vaccine, it just cuts your entire infrastructure in half, the costs in half. And I think this is where I think we need to have a discussion about how do we take on J&J. In India, they have an exclusive license with Biological E. They will not allow anybody else to produce it. And I'm sure Biological E will not be happy if someone else produces it. So the problem of exclusive licensing, South Africa has the problem of fill and finish. We have the problem of exclusive licensing, a little bit downstream problem, but nevertheless a problem. And I think this is where I feel that some of us as activists should come together to talk about the J&J single dose vaccine. What do you want to do about it, from the African context, from the Indian context, from the Canadian context? And can we also, work on access to the single dose J&J vaccine? So, in that sense, I think we have a very good, cross-cutting North-South civil society issue that we could actually collaborate on greatly between India, South Africa, Africa Union, and Canada, and of other activists. And I can't even imagine if, I'm sure Latin America would also love a single dose vaccine. Who doesn't want a single dose vaccine? Number two is this, that on the issue of the waiver and patents, the problem is that everyone's just shooting in the dark. They don't really know how the intellectual property system works. I mean, people like us who've done a grunt work of, filing right to information applications to get to know what claims have been filed. You don't really know today what's in the pipeline in terms of intellectual property. So everyone's just purely speculating whether IP is a problem or not a problem, And anybody who looks at the problem with regulatory bodies and the lack of transparency, they always quote Article 39.3 at us. It's great. It's not about just exclusivity. It also sort of allows regulatory bodies to be less transparent because of Article 39.3 and the excuses they make up for it in the absence of any overarching law that forces them to be transparent. So I think we really need to start having these discussions between, different regions about what are we going to do about the TRIPS waiver, what are we going to do about the single dose J&J vaccine, and what are we going to do about the cult of the mRNA, as I call it.
I've been thinking a lot about the conversation that started, and I really like the conversation. I think generally that I'm seeing also amongst academics, which is this idea of public good. And I think that really, I get the feeling that would be almost the end point of all of this. But I'd love to hear from everyone where this conversation will be going.
One quick thought is, you know, we've also tried to use the rhetoric and norms of human rights, you know, as a way to convince the world, and you know, made some progress, but of course, governments still are largely resistant to actually recognize such obligations, particularly in the part of pharmaceutical companies, but also in terms of their own regulation of pharmaceutical companies. And you know, so we made some progress. So I like ideas that can capture imagination, but there's no particular magic to public goods that makes it distinct and different from human rights in some ways. And so I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to try to convince people that there are certain kinds of goods which are so essential to well-being. And it would not just in that instance be medicines, it would be food and some other things too, but that are so essential that they should not be treated as commodities and subject to commercial prerogatives only. That makes sense to me, but I think the same headwinds apply in terms of whether government pay attention and whether corporations are forced to pay attention.
I might come in on that because I specifically mentioned global public goods in my talk, and I think I'm referring to that because I'm coming from a place not just focused on vaccines and IP, but thinking from a more sort of industrial capacity development side of things, and thinking about what does it mean to have global public goods or to be prepared with an architecture for such a thing as a global public good, moving into the massive global industrial transformation that will be necessary to take on climate change. And, you know, we're obviously in the midst of the pandemic right now, and it can be difficult to think what feels like something far ahead, but is obviously unfolding and is affecting millions of people's lives right now. And one of the things I think the TRIPS waiver conversation, the tech transfer conversation is very applicable to is around what happens to green technologies that will be fundamental to the transition of our energy systems and our way of life, and who gets to benefit from them. So I totally hear Brook's point on, you know, a human rights framework and a rights-based approach, but also there's something about the political economy aspect, that economic of who owns it and who benefits from it and who reaps the profits from it. And I think without thinking around that element, I think that it's very you know, crudely the opportunity of this conversation to blow open some of what should be fundamental common public goods that are necessary for our shared humanity's survival. I don't know if that would happen if we focused on it just on rights-based, although of course that needs to be a part of that. And I suppose just to go back to that original question or provocation that Brook had about, you know, about the regional sort of why is it necessary to have all of that parts, and that I think that's also deeply connected, you know, to, you know, the shortcomings of a global value chains sort of global economy where, you know, it greases the wheels of foreign direct investment and for companies to extract what they need, but doesn't necessarily have positive spillover effects for social or economic development outcomes, and doesn't necessarily mean that there's resilience from a sort of jobs or rights perspective. So yeah, you may have one part of a supply chain, but if that's not building up you've seen the sort of issues that emerges comparing, you know, the case where a country is able to retain those supply chains internally to their region, and provide for their folk, for their people, versus that being industry led and industry controlled. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Felipe, there is a question for you. What is the position of Brazil towards IP waiver? The position of Brazil towards the IP waiver is worrisome, and how can activists across the globe do to push Brazil to support the IP waiver?
Okay. Yeah. No. Thanks for the question. Actually, Brazil's position has been changing over time. The initial position was more pronounced against the proposal, but then it became more of a middle ground position. But in some moments, Brazil actually said more clearly that supported the discussion. It's always like, we support the discussion, we are open to hear, but they are not really helping to progress the negotiations, but also they are not blocking anymore. So this is important change that was only achieved thanks to pressure. So thanks for asking about civil society pressure, because that was a key factor in changing Brazil's position, both national pressure from civil society, parliamentarians, national stakeholders, demanding the Minister of Brazil's Foreign Affairs to explain and really change, and especially after the US has changed its own position, somehow there was increased pressure. But even before that, there were protests in South Africa and India that were quite remarkable in front of Brazilian embassies, and that was really something that also was a very important moment to put them on the spotlight, to really highlight how their position is contrasting with the historical positions that Brazil has taken in this kind of debates. So next, I mean, we are still pending to see how Brazil will behave in the next rounds, and this may require some campaign efforts, and we are happy to get people all over the world to support on putting Brazil in the spotlight if needed. But now they are more in a kind of middle ground position as many other countries in Latin America. So it's a bit hard to, of course, it's more important now to put pressure on European countries and others that are more vocally opposing the proposal itself. But yeah, I think the pressure on Brazil has worked quite well so far. And just a quick comment on the public goods question. I think there are different aspects that need to be combined. I mean, because sometimes we talk about this topic as if we need to create a whole new framework, but actually there are some pieces already under development that we should maybe have a more deep look. As Brook said, like the correlation with human rights is quite evident. So I think what we as activists have been trying to do over the past years is to show this direct correlation between monopolies and the violation of the right to health, make very clear this link, and how a system that doesn't rely on monopolies would avoid this kind of violation. But I think looking to the human rights is also important, maybe to discuss more something that is not really strong in the human rights agenda, but it's the enjoyment of scientific progress, the right to enjoy the scientific progress, and that's a right that people also should have been that should be reinforced in moments like a health crisis where people do need the most advanced tools. So I think building upon the idea of human rights to really make this concept work, it's interesting. But also let's remember that when we say public goods, we also are speaking somehow about the public domain, knowledge in the public domain that anyone can access. So in order to have that, sometimes we just need to avoid the expropriation of knowledge from the public domain that is happening through the mechanics of the patent system. So that's why there is a lot of work on laws and regulations, that it's very hard, it's long term, but it's exactly to reach a point where there is no undeserved expropriation of knowledge from the public domain. And lastly, I think the new discussions that should be improved are more like about public ownership of, for example, clinical trial data. How can we make the case around the fact that people are contributing to this clinical studies can be translated into a public goods framework? also the financing through public funds, how really can we capture that aspect in a public goods framework. So there are different pieces that need to be combined until we reach a real systemic and concrete mechanism to talk about public goods.
Thank you. I don't know if Leena is here as well, if she wanted to contribute to the question, but I also see that there is a question in the chat. Kimani Goddard talks about, is there an opportunity under the cover of the waiver for the development of a set of indicators that provide precise regulatory economic data on structure of publicly funded pharma research projects? So this is probably connected a little bit to what the public goods thing is, and feed into patents and pharma proprietary rights. Perhaps this kind of data will provide a basis to streamline the compulsory license system. Leena first, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the indicators part of it. So if someone wants to take that first before I raise my hand on the previous issue, yeah.
Anyone wants to talk about the indicators? Leena.
I mean, one thing. Oh, I don't have a specific opinion on a set of indicators, but I would say I think something that has been surfaced by the pandemic was that the governments that did have the fiscal space obviously very quickly moved big to often invest tens of billions of dollars into vaccine production scaling up. You know, the UK, for example, where I am based, went from having 2 small vaccine producing facilities to they will have 6 by the end of this year. And the US, obviously, a magnitude greater than that, but also and other countries too have put in a lot of financing upfront or in pre-orders. And I think it's clear that there needs to be more transparency of what is happening to public funds that are being subsidizing an R&D system for then that company to make all the benefits and all the profits with no accountability of serving the public. So I do think we need to think about, this isn't a good deal for the people of these countries, and it isn't a good deal for a global public who have a right to these vaccines. And I do think that this is a huge issue of transparency, of the use of public funds, and just of being able to broker a better relationship there, where if in that early, without having more transparency, it's difficult to know. But it could be the case that there's more rights and access to some of that patent information than we know right now. So I think that definitely needs more transparency at the national level, but also more international collaboration to share and benefit from that, like CTAP was initially supposed to be facilitating.
Leena, I'm going to let you go ahead, and then Brook, I think you could have the final say.
I just wanted to say this, that on the human rights front, I remember the days when we were doing EU India and we would file these complaints with special rapporteur, and I think some of that work hasn't really happened from us, to be very honest. It's been absent. Many times I wanted to, when Pfizer and Moderna have been holding India hostage on the mRNA vaccine, they first said that we will not do local clinical trials unless you waive the requirement of local clinical trials. We will not introduce the vaccine. They filed the dossiers and then they actually removed them. So they got India to remove the requirement of local clinical trials. Then they said, well, we want indemnity, and then the government almost gave them indemnity, except when the government of India actually read the clauses on indemnity. It's everything. Right through the supply chain, anything that goes wrong on the Pfizer end becomes the government of India's liability. And number 3, they said that the jurisdiction for any dispute would not be Indian courts, despite the contract being to supply the vaccines to the Indian government. And in a sense, they have been holding the Indian government hostage and depriving actually a significant tool to prevent COVID to the Indian population, particularly, for example, today the biggest issue that is being discussed in Indian papers is about kids not being able to go back to school, and it's really impacting the right to education. And can kids be vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine from 12 to 18? Luckily, we have now an Indian vaccine, but nevertheless, I just wanted to highlight that we do need to file these complaints to the special rapporteurs as individual citizens and people, and collaborate a bit more on these complaints to the special rapporteur. The second thing I wanted to highlight, without taking too much time, is how everyone's told us that how the human rights and the patent system does not work. So Felipe has Brazilian colleagues have come up with a brilliant idea on challenging the monopoly of BioNTech. But I can tell you, every step of the way, legal experts tell us that this will not work. And that's exactly how the system does not work. Not in Germany, not anywhere. They've stacked the system on compulsory licensing against us, deliberately so. And what's worse is that even in human rights, you have to exhaust domestic remedies. And I think there are two schools of thought for the European Human Rights Court. Is that, do you really need to exhaust domestic remedies in a situation like a pandemic? Normally you would, but could this be an exception that you have to exhaust domestic remedies? And I actually, agree with the Brazilian lawyers and not with the other lawyers, set of lawyers. And I wish we could have more of these conversations among us who have done this work in the past. Yeah, that's it.
Go ahead, Brook.
So my last point, I hope, is brief, and it piggybacks on what Katie was saying about the question on, transparent, it's fundamentally a transparency question. And a lot of our conversation today has focused on the two villains of the piece. The villains are governments and companies, right? I mean, that they are standing hand in hand. Governments are tying their own hands. They give out money with no strings. They let companies take the monopoly, building on, the research has been funded, hugely in response to COVID, and they let them get away with monopoly rights, and then they let them raise prices again. So we see Pfizer and Moderna both raising their vaccine prices without one iota of additional efficacy actually shown, but just because they have the power to do so. But then we also have governments that gag themselves. They allow confidentiality agreements and are non-transparent about the very information that's needed by the public and by other stakeholders with respect to multiple forms of important information. Even what they spend, what they've given companies, but certainly what R&D costs are, et cetera, et cetera. So there is we have to have two bullhorns. We have to have a bullhorn at companies, and we have to have a bullhorn at governments. And of course, rich governments are the biggest problem, but frankly, Southern governments are sitting, are silencing themselves and sitting on their hands as well. South Africa has not yet passed the Fix the Patent Law campaign, patent law reform. That campaign is now, in 2 more months, 10 years old. Okay, and where is the bill right now? Is it sitting, in some office waiting for some bureaucrat to approve it? So, I think we have to, as everyone on this call is probably already doing, we have to make common cause to fight both big pharma and lazy, stupid, and governments that aren't doing their jobs.
Thank you, Brook. I think you have ended this really well because you've given us direction, what we need to do, where we need to put our energies, and I think again, I take heart from Brazil's, the gains they've made. We can in South Africa, we can really learn from that. It's a constant drive, and it's about the long-term gains, and I think we have to move. I appreciate this so much. Thank you, Leena, Felipe, Katie, Brook. I mean, this was amazing. I enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else does. And and again, have a great day. Let's all keep chipping away. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafia. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.